If she hadn't found you when she did, you wouldn't have survived.
The woman I hated became the reason I'm still alive. Those words sound impossible until you understand everything that happened before that moment. Imagine opening your eyes in a hospital room, every breath reminding you that you came within seconds of never seeing another sunrise. Your memories are scattered, your body refuses to cooperate, and the first clear voice you hear is a nurse quietly saying, "If she hadn't found you when she did, you wouldn't have survived." You force yourself to look toward the doorway, expecting to see a family member, a close friend, or perhaps one of the doctors. Instead, standing silently at the entrance is the last person you ever wanted to see again. Vanessa Carter, the woman who walked away with your husband years earlier. The woman whose name had become a symbol of every sleepless night, every broken promise, and every painful memory you spent years trying to forget. She doesn't smile. She doesn't ask for forgiveness. She simply stands there, carrying a burden that neither of you fully understands. And in that single moment, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why would the woman who helped destroy your life become the very person who refused to let you die? Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Also tell us this. If someone shattered your marriage but later risked everything to save your life, would you ever be able to forgive them? Keep that answer in your mind, because by the end of this story, you may see forgiveness in a completely different way. Claire Bennett never imagined her life would become a story people would struggle to believe. For more than 2 decades, she believed she understood the man she married. Michael Bennett was dependable, respected, and admired by almost everyone who knew him. Together, they built a comfortable life in Washington state, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and family who often described them as the couple everyone wished they could become. Their home was filled with photographs for vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary weekends that seemed too happy to ever disappear. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. There were no loud arguments spilling into the street, no dramatic scenes that hinted their marriage was coming apart. If you had asked anyone who knew them, they would have confidently said Claire and Michael would grow old together. Yet years later, Claire would find herself lying in that hospital bed, staring into the eyes of the woman she blamed for destroying everything she had spent a lifetime building. The road between those two moments was filled with choices, secrets, and discoveries that no one could have predicted. At first, Claire believed Vanessa was simply the reason her marriage ended. It was the easiest explanation to accept because heartbreak often demands someone to blame. Friends quietly whispered that Michael had fallen in love with someone younger. Others insisted Claire must have missed warning signs that had been there for years. Rumors spread quickly, each version sounding more convincing than the last. But none of those stories explained why Michael suddenly became so distant before leaving. None explained the fear that occasionally crossed his face when he believed nobody was watching. None explained why, even after starting a new life with Vanessa, he continued making strange decisions that confused everyone around him. Claire tried to convince herself none of it mattered anymore. She focused on rebuilding her life one day at a time, believing the past belonged exactly where it should remain. She had no idea that the past wasn't finished with her. Long after the divorce papers were signed and Michael disappeared into another life, invisible threads were still connecting all 3 of them, waiting for the moment they would tighten all at once. The day Claire almost lost her life was not random, and neither was the fact that Vanessa arrived exactly when she did. Someone else had been watching events unfold for much longer than either woman realized. Hidden beneath the story of a broken marriage was another story that stretched back years, one involving trust, deception, and decisions made in silence. Michael carried truths he never shared with either woman, truths that would continue affecting their lives even after his own had come to an end. His death was supposed to close the final chapter. Instead, it became the beginning of an investigation that would force two women who couldn't stand each other to confront a reality neither wanted to believe. One had lost a husband. The other believed she had found love. Both would eventually discover they had been living inside a story that was far different from the one they thought they knew. And once the first piece of that hidden truth came into the light, there would be no turning back. Claire Bennett was 48 years old when she finally realized that the strongest relationships are not always the ones that survive the longest. Sometimes they're simply the ones that hide their cracks the best. If you had met Claire and Michael Bennett 10 years earlier, you probably would have described them as the kind of couple every neighborhood admired. They lived in a quiet suburb outside Seattle, Washington, in a beautiful two-story home surrounded by tall, evergreen trees. Their front porch was decorated with flowers that Claire carefully tended every weekend, and every December, their Christmas lights became something neighbors looked forward to seeing. Michael, 51, was a respected financial consultant who had spent nearly 3 decades building a reputation for honesty and professionalism. Claire worked as a middle school librarian, a career she loved because she believed books had the power to change lives. Together, they had raised 2 wonderful children who are now adults, living their own lives while staying close to home. To everyone who knew them, the Bennetts represented stability, commitment, and the American dream. They laughed together, hosted backyard barbecues every summer, celebrated anniversaries with weekend trips along the Washington coast, and never gave anyone a reason to believe that trouble was quietly making its way into their lives. Looking back years later, Claire often wondered whether the perfect life she remembered had ever truly existed or whether she had simply become very good at believing everything was exactly as it appeared. For 23 years, Claire trusted Michael without hesitation. She never felt the need to check his phone, question his business trips, or wonder where he had been after work. Trust had become the foundation of their marriage because Michael had earned it over many years. He remembered birthdays, never missed family gatherings, and always found time to help neighbors whenever they needed a hand. Friends often joked that men like Michael no longer existed. Claire believed she was one of the luckiest women in America. Their children often teased them about still holding hands during walks around the neighborhood. And every anniversary, Michael wrote Claire a handwritten letter explaining why he still chose her after all those years. Claire kept every one of those letters in a wooden box inside their bedroom closet, reading them whenever life became difficult. She never imagined that one day those letters would become painful reminders of a man she thought she knew, but perhaps never truly understood. If someone had approached Claire during those years and suggested Michael was capable of betraying her, she would have laughed and defended him without hesitation. That confidence made what happened next even more devastating because betrayal hurts most when it comes from the person you trusted beyond question. The first changes were so small that Claire almost dismissed them completely. Michael began staying later at the office, explaining that his firm had taken on several important clients who required extra attention. His phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, never seemed to leave his pocket anymore. During dinner, it buzzed more often than usual, but he rarely answered in front of Claire. Instead, he would glance at the screen, excuse himself politely, and continue the conversation somewhere outside where she couldn't hear him. Claire noticed these things, but she refused to let suspicion replace trust. After all, careers changed, responsibilities increased, and successful people often worked longer hours. She convinced herself there had to be reasonable explanations for every unusual habit. Yet as weeks turned into months, the distance between them slowly became impossible to ignore. Michael no longer shared stories about his workday. Weekend hikes they had enjoyed for years suddenly disappeared from their routine because he was always tired or called away by another unexpected business obligation. Even simple conversations felt shorter than they used to be. Claire found herself sitting alone on the back porch more often, wondering why the man who once couldn't wait to come home now seemed to search for reasons to stay away. She didn't realize those quiet evenings marked the beginning of the most painful chapter of her life. Everything changed on an ordinary Thursday afternoon that began like countless others before it. Claire had planned to surprise Michael by meeting him near his office so they could enjoy lunch together, something they hadn't done in months. She smiled during the drive, remembering how much they used to enjoy escaping work for an hour just to talk about life, family, and future plans. But when she arrived, Michael's assistant casually mentioned he had already left for a client meeting across town. Something about the explanation felt unusual. Michael had never mentioned any meeting that morning, and for reasons she still couldn't explain, Claire decided to follow the route his assistant had described. 20 minutes later, she parked across the street from an upscale restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay. She watched as Michael stepped out of his car, adjusted his jacket, and smiled in a way she hadn't seen in months. Then another woman approached him. She was attractive, confident, and several years younger than Claire. Before entering the restaurant, Michael reached for her hand. It wasn't the polite gesture of colleagues greeting one another. It was familiar, comfortable, intimate. Claire felt as though the world around her had stopped moving. She remained frozen behind the steering wheel, unable to breathe properly as she watched the man she had loved for more than 2 decades disappear through the restaurant doors beside someone she had never seen before. At that moment, Claire Bennett believed she had uncovered the entire truth. She had no idea she had only uncovered the first piece of a mystery that would eventually place her own life in danger. Claire Bennett sat in her car for nearly an hour after watching Michael walk into that restaurant with another woman. She never gathered the courage to follow them inside. She didn't need to. The way he smiled, the way he reached for her hand, and the ease with which they disappeared together told Claire everything she believed she needed to know. During the drive home, she replayed those few seconds over and over, hoping she had misunderstood what she'd seen. Perhaps it was a client. Perhaps there was another explanation. But deep inside, the truth had already settled in her heart. When Michael returned home that evening, he greeted her with the same calm voice he always used, asking how her day had gone as though nothing had happened. Claire looked into his eyes, searching for even the smallest sign of guilt, but his expression remained steady. She finally asked the question that had been echoing in her mind all afternoon. Who is she? The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Michael didn't deny it. He didn't become angry or accuse Claire of imagining things. Instead, he lowered his head, sat quietly at the kitchen table, and admitted there was someone else. Her name was Vanessa Carter. He claimed it hadn't been planned, that he never intended for their friendship to become something more, but those explanations meant nothing to Claire. 23 years of marriage had just been reduced to a conversation lasting only a few minutes. The weeks that followed were among the hardest Claire had ever experienced. Michael packed his belongings with surprising calmness, promising he never wanted to hurt her, but insisting he could no longer continue living a life that wasn't honest. Claire struggled to understand how honesty had suddenly become important after months of deception. Friends and relatives quickly chose sides, even when they claimed they weren't. Some supported Claire without question, while others quietly suggested that marriages often fail because both people make mistakes. Those comments hurt almost as much as Michael's departure because they made Claire feel responsible for a decision she never made. Soon, word spread throughout their community. Neighbors who once waved warmly from across the street now exchanged awkward smiles before quickly looking away. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. Claire discovered that divorce didn't only change her relationship with Michael. It changed the way people looked at her. She buried herself in her work at the library, spending longer hours organizing books and helping students simply because it gave her fewer opportunities to think. Every room inside the house reminded her of memories she wished she could forget, but couldn't bring herself to erase. The family photographs remained on the walls because taking them down somehow felt like admitting those years had never mattered. 6 months after moving out, Michael married Vanessa in a small private ceremony. Claire learned about it the same way everyone else did, through photographs posted online by people who congratulated the happy couple without knowing the pain those images would cause. She stared at one picture longer than the others. Michael looked genuinely happy. Vanessa rested her head against his shoulder, smiling as though their future was just beginning. Claire wanted to hate her, and for a long time she did. In her mind, Vanessa wasn't simply another woman. She represented every broken promise, every lonely evening, and every dream that disappeared the day Michael walked away. Whenever Claire heard Vanessa's name, anger replaced sadness because anger was easier to carry than heartbreak. Yet there was one thing she could never fully understand. Even after marrying Vanessa, Michael occasionally called their children for no apparent reason, asking strange questions about Claire. Was she doing okay? Had anyone been bothering her? Was she still living alone? At first, the children assumed he simply felt guilty about how everything had ended. Claire accepted that explanation too, although something about those conversations felt unusual. Michael never asked whether she had forgiven him or whether she was seeing someone new. His questions always focused on her safety, and no one could explain why. 3 years passed, and time slowly helped Claire rebuild a life she never expected to have. She downsized into a smaller home, continued working at the library, and found comfort in routines that no longer included Michael. The pain never completely disappeared, but it became manageable. She stopped checking social media, stopped wondering what Michael and Vanessa were doing, and finally convinced herself that chapter of her life had ended. Then, without warning, everything changed again. One rainy Tuesday morning, Claire received a phone call from her daughter. Michael had died suddenly during the night. According to the doctors, it was a massive heart attack. He was only 51 years old. Claire didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Grief mixed with confusion, sadness collided with old wounds, and memories she had spent years burying suddenly returned all at once. Against her better judgment, she attended the funeral, choosing a quiet seat near the back of the church where she hoped to remain unnoticed. It was there for the first time in years that she saw Vanessa again. But something immediately caught Claire's attention. Vanessa wasn't crying like everyone expected a grieving widow to cry. She wasn't speaking to guests or accepting condolences with quiet gratitude. Instead, she repeatedly looked over her shoulder toward the church entrance as though she believed someone dangerous might walk through those doors at any moment. It wasn't the expression of a woman mourning her husband. It was the expression of someone living in fear. Claire left the funeral believing she would never see Vanessa again. She couldn't have been more wrong. Less than a week later, an unexpected knock at her front door would begin revealing the truth Michael had taken to his grave. Less than a week after Michael Bennett's funeral, Claire convinced herself she was finally ready to close that chapter of her life forever. She returned to work at the library, organized a community reading program, and tried to focus on the future instead of the memories that kept finding their way back in her mind. But every attempt to move on was interrupted by one question she couldn't answer. Why had Vanessa looked so frightened at the funeral? It wasn't the look of a grieving widow overwhelmed by loss. Claire had seen grief before. She had experienced it herself. What she saw in Vanessa's eyes was something completely different. It was the kind of fear that comes from believing someone is watching your every move. Claire tried to dismiss the thought, reminding herself that Vanessa was no longer part of her life. Then, late one evening, someone knocked on her front door. Standing outside was Vanessa. She looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. Her clothes were damp from the steady Washington rain, and she repeatedly glanced over her shoulder before speaking. Her voice trembled as she said, "Claire, I know you don't want to see me. I wouldn't blame you if you told me to leave. But Michael didn't tell either of us the truth, and if I don't explain what little I know, I honestly believe both of us are in danger. Claire stared at the woman she had blamed for years without saying a word. Every painful memory came rushing back at once. Before Vanessa could continue, Claire quietly closed the door. She wasn't ready to hear anything from the woman she believed had destroyed her family. The following morning, Claire regretted nothing about her decision. She convinced herself Vanessa was overwhelmed by grief and searching for someone to share her pain with. That explanation made far more sense than believing she was somehow in danger. But 2 days later, an envelope appeared inside Claire's mailbox with no return address and no postage stamp, suggesting it had been delivered by hand. Inside was a single sheet of white paper. Across the center, typed in bold black letters, were only 2 words, "You're next." Claire's first thought was that someone had played a cruel prank. She threw the paper into the kitchen trash and tried to ignore it. The next morning, another envelope appeared. It contained the exact same message. The day after that, a third envelope arrived. This time, beneath the words, "You're next," someone had added another sentence. "He couldn't protect you forever." Claire felt a chill run through her entire body. Very few people even knew Michael had once promised to protect her from anything life might bring. It was something he used to say during difficult times early in their marriage. Somehow, a complete stranger had written words that carried meaning only Michael and Claire had shared. For the first time since the divorce, fear began replacing anger. She immediately contacted the local police, but without fingerprints, witnesses, or security camera footage, there was very little they could investigate. Officers advised her to remain alert and report any unusual activity. It wasn't the reassurance Claire had hoped to hear. Only 3 nights later, Claire woke to the sound of breaking glass somewhere downstairs. Her heart raced as she reached for her phone and quietly called 911. Remaining inside her bedroom until officers arrived felt like the longest 15 minutes of her life. When detectives searched the house, they discovered something that puzzled everyone involved. Expensive jewelry remained untouched. Cash inside a kitchen drawer was still there. Her laptop, television, and other valuables had not been taken. Instead, whoever entered the house had searched one specific cabinet inside Michael's old home office. Several boxes containing financial records, tax documents, and old business files had been scattered across the floor. Most had been ignored. Only one small storage box was missing. Claire recognized it immediately. It contained copies of Michael's personal work files from several years earlier, documents he had once brought home after saying he wanted extra records stored somewhere safe. At the time, Claire never questioned why he needed duplicate copies. Now, someone had broken into her home for the sole purpose of taking them. Detective Ryan Ellis, a veteran investigator with more than 30 years of experience, examined the scene carefully before asking Claire a question she never expected. "Mrs. Bennett, did your husband ever mention having problems at work? Arguments with business partners? Clients making threats?" Claire shook her head. Michael had always described his career as stressful but rewarding. Detective Ellis nodded thoughtfully before saying something that stayed with Claire long after he left. "People don't usually risk prison to steal old paperwork unless those papers still matter." The next afternoon, Claire received another unexpected visitor. This time, she opened the door before the knocking had fully stopped. Vanessa stood there again, but she wasn't alone. She carried a worn leather folder pressed tightly against her chest. Without waiting for permission, she quietly said, "Please, just give me 5 minutes. After that, if you never want to see me again, I'll disappear forever." Claire hesitated before finally stepping aside. They sat across from one another in complete silence until Vanessa slowly opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed emails, handwritten notes, and copies of financial statements covered with Michael's own handwritten comments. Vanessa took a deep breath before speaking. "Michael wasn't living 2 separate lives because he stopped loving you. At least, that's not the whole story. About 4 years before he left, he discovered something at work he was never supposed to find. Millions of dollars were disappearing through fake charities and shell companies. Some of the people involved were wealthy, influential, and connected to individuals no ordinary employee would ever challenge. He wanted to expose them, but once they realized what he knew, everything changed. He told me someone was following him. Someone was watching both of you. Claire stared at Vanessa, unable to believe what she was hearing. Every part of her wanted to call it another lie. Yet the fear in Vanessa's voice was impossible to fake. Then Vanessa quietly revealed the one truth that shattered everything Claire believed she knew. Michael didn't meet me by accident. He came into my life because he believed I unknowingly worked close to people connected to that operation. He thought staying near me would help him gather evidence without placing you directly in danger. Claire's heart pounded as years of unanswered questions suddenly began fitting together. But before she could ask another question, both women heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching to a stop outside the house. Someone had found them. Someone knew they were finally putting the pieces together. And from that moment on, neither Claire nor Vanessa would ever be safe again. Claire Bennett barely had time to process everything Vanessa Carter had just revealed before both women instinctively fell silent. The screeching tires outside Claire's home lasted only a few seconds, followed by the sound of a vehicle accelerating away. Vanessa slowly pulled back the edge of the living room curtain and looked toward the street. The dark SUV she had seen circling her neighborhood several times during the past week was already disappearing around the corner. She stepped away from the window, her face noticeably paler than before. "They're watching us," she whispered. Claire wanted to dismiss the statement as fear taking control of Vanessa's imagination, but too many strange events had happened in such a short period. The anonymous letters, the break-in that targeted only Michael's old files, Detective Ryan Ellis's growing concern, and now an unfamiliar vehicle appearing moments after Vanessa shared Michael's secret. None of it felt like coincidence anymore. Claire realized something that deeply unsettled her. For years, she had believed Vanessa was the reason her marriage ended. Now, she was beginning to wonder whether Vanessa had been trapped in the same dangerous situation without fully understanding it herself. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it forced Claire to question whether she had been blaming the wrong person all along. The following morning, Detective Ryan Ellis arranged to meet both women at a quiet coffee shop several miles outside the city. He believed it was safer than speaking inside either of their homes. After listening carefully to Vanessa's account and examining the document she had brought, Ryan remained silent for several moments before removing a worn notebook from his briefcase. He explained that Michael Bennett's name had quietly appeared in an unrelated federal investigation nearly 2 years before his death. At the time, investigators believed Michael might have been helping authorities uncover an elaborate financial fraud involving investment firms, charitable foundations, and shell corporations spread across multiple states. Unfortunately, before agents could formally interview him, Michael died from what doctors ruled to be a sudden heart attack. Because there was no immediate evidence suggesting foul play, the investigation shifted in another direction. Ryan admitted something that immediately caught Claire's attention. "I've never been completely comfortable with how quickly Michael's death was accepted. Healthy men his age can suffer heart attacks, but certain details in his medical reports raised questions that were never fully explored." Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. For the first time, she considered the possibility that Michael's death had not been as natural as everyone believed. If that was true, the people responsible might still be trying to erase every remaining piece of evidence. Detective Ellis advised both women to avoid traveling alone until investigators could better understand who might still be searching for Michael's files. Claire reluctantly agreed, although she struggled with the uncomfortable reality of relying on the woman she had spent years despising. Later that afternoon, Vanessa suggested they visit Michael's old lake cabin, a place neither of them had entered since his death. According to Vanessa, Michael had occasionally disappeared there alone for entire weekends, claiming he needed peace and quiet to organize paperwork or prepare presentations. At the time, she believed him. Now, she suspected he had been hiding something there. The cabin sat deep within a forest overlooking a quiet lake nearly 2 hours from Seattle. As Claire and Vanessa drove along the winding road, neither woman spoke much. The silence between them was heavy, filled with memories, regret, and questions that still had no answers. When they finally arrived, the property appeared untouched. Fallen leaves covered the porch, and dust coated the windows, making it obvious no one had visited for months. Inside, everything looked exactly as Michael had left it. Books remained neatly arranged on shelves. Family photographs still rested on the fireplace mantel, and an old fishing rod leaned against the wall. For a brief moment, Claire felt as though Michael might walk through the door at any second. But they hadn't come searching for memories. They had come searching for the truth. After nearly 2 hours of carefully examining every drawer, cabinet, and storage box inside the cabin, frustration began replacing hope. Nothing seemed unusual. Claire questioned whether the trip had been a mistake. Vanessa, however, refused to give up. She remembered Michael often saying that the safest hiding place was somewhere nobody would think to search because it appeared too ordinary to matter. Those words lingered in her mind as she looked toward an old family photo album resting alone on a bookshelf. It contained vacation pictures taken years before Vanessa ever entered Michael's life. Curious, she opened the album and noticed something unusual about its weight. The cover felt much thicker than it should have. Carefully running her fingers along the inside edge, she discovered a hidden compartment sealed beneath the binding. Before either woman could react, a loud engine roared outside the cabin. Headlights swept across the windows, even though the sun had not yet set. Someone else had arrived. Claire hurried toward the front door just as a pickup truck accelerated directly toward the cabin instead of stopping in the driveway. Everything happened within seconds. Vanessa saw the truck changing direction toward Claire, shouted her name, and threw herself forward with every ounce of strength she had. The impact knocked Claire violently to the ground moments before the truck slammed into the front porch, sending wood and shattered glass flying in every direction. Claire struck her head against the floor, but remained conscious. Vanessa wasn't as fortunate. A large timber collapsed across her legs, trapping her beneath the debris. The truck's driver reversed immediately and disappeared down the narrow forest road before either woman could see a face or license plate. As Claire struggled to reach Vanessa through the dust and broken timber, one overwhelming realization filled her mind. The woman she had blamed for destroying her marriage had just risked, and nearly lost, her own life to save hers. Everything Claire believed about Vanessa was beginning to change, and hidden inside that old photo album was evidence someone was clearly willing to kill to keep buried forever. The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the forest as Claire Bennett knelt beside Vanessa Carter, desperately trying to keep her awake. Splintered wood surrounded them, shattered glass covered the cabin floor, and the old front porch had been reduced to a pile of broken timber. Vanessa's breathing was shallow, but she remained conscious. Claire held her hand tightly, repeating the same words over and over. "Stay with me. Help is coming." It was a sentence Claire never imagined she would say to the woman she had blamed for destroying her marriage. Only a few years earlier, she couldn't even bear hearing Vanessa's name. Now, nothing else mattered except making sure she survived. Paramedics arrived within minutes, carefully lifting the heavy beam that had pinned Vanessa beneath the wreckage before rushing her to the nearest trauma center. Detective Ryan Ellis reached the cabin shortly afterward and immediately realized the crash had not been an accident. Tire marks showed the driver had deliberately steered toward the porch instead of attempting to stop. Whoever had come to the cabin wasn't trying to frighten Claire and Vanessa. They had intended to make sure neither woman ever walked away. As investigators searched the damaged cabin, Claire remembered the hidden compartment inside the old family photo album. Despite the destruction, she carefully retrieved it from beneath scattered debris and opened the concealed section. Inside were 3 encrypted flash drives and a handwritten note in Michael Bennett's unmistakable handwriting. The note contained only one sentence. "If you're reading this, the truth is finally more important than my secrets." Back at the hospital, forensic specialists began examining the flash drives while federal investigators joined Detective Ellis's team. It took several hours before the encrypted files could be accessed, but what they discovered explained nearly every unanswered question surrounding Michael's final years. Hidden inside were thousands of confidential financial records, internal emails, recorded conversations, and transaction histories documenting a sophisticated fraud operation involving fake charities, investment companies, and shell corporations that had quietly moved millions of dollars over several years. The evidence connected respected executives, financial advisors, and influential business leaders across multiple states. Michael had spent years gathering information after accidentally uncovering irregularities during a routine audit. According to his personal journal, he initially believed reporting the suspicious transactions through normal company channels would solve the problem. Instead, the moment questions were raised, trusted colleagues began distancing themselves from him. Anonymous threats followed. His vehicle was vandalized. Someone repeatedly entered his office without taking anything, making it clear they wanted him to know they could reach him whenever they wished. Michael eventually realized the corruption reached far beyond his own workplace. He feared that anyone close to him could become a target, especially Claire. Believing he could protect her by creating emotional distance, he made the heartbreaking decision to leave the marriage. It was a decision that devastated the woman he still loved, but one he believed might keep her alive. His greatest mistake was believing those responsible would stop searching once he disappeared from her life. As investigators continued reviewing Michael's files, another shocking discovery emerged. Several weeks before his death, Michael had secretly met with federal authorities and agreed to become a confidential witness. He had planned to hand over the complete evidence package within days. That meeting never happened. His sudden heart attack, once accepted without question, was officially reopened as part of a homicide investigation after toxicology experts found irregularities preserved in archived medical samples. While investigators never publicly disclosed every detail, they confirmed there was enough evidence to believe Michael's death had not been entirely natural. Over the following months, search warrants were executed across multiple states. Corporate offices were raided before sunrise. Financial records were seized. Several prominent executives were arrested on charges including fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. News outlets across the United States covered the story for weeks as more details became public. People who had once admired those business leaders watched in disbelief as years of carefully hidden corruption finally came to light. Detective Ryan Ellis later admitted that without the flash drives hidden inside that old family photo album, the investigation might never have reached its conclusion. Michael's decision to preserve the evidence had ultimately exposed the very people who believed they had silenced him forever. Several months later, Claire visited Vanessa at a rehabilitation center overlooking Puget Sound. Vanessa had survived the attack, but faced months of physical therapy before she could fully recover. As Claire entered the room, both women smiled awkwardly, remembering how impossible that moment would have seemed only a short time earlier. Neither attempted to rewrite history or pretend the pain had never existed. Claire acknowledged that losing Michael had nearly destroyed her, while Vanessa admitted she had spent years carrying guilt for becoming part of a marriage that had already begun falling apart under pressures she never understood. They talked for hours, not as rivals, but as two women whose lives had been shaped by the same man's impossible choices. Claire finally asked the question she had carried since the day Michael left. Did he ever stop loving me? Vanessa looked out the window before quietly answering, No, I don't think he ever did. I think he convinced himself that making you hate him was the only way to keep you out of danger. He believed if you moved on, they'd stop watching you. He was wrong, but everything he did after that came from fear, not from a lack of love. Claire closed her eyes as tears slowly filled them. For years, she had carried anger that now gave way to something far more complicated. She could never recover the marriage she lost, nor erase the loneliness that followed, but she finally understood the truth Michael had taken to his grave. Years later, Claire often reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had forever changed her life. People frequently asked whether she had forgiven Vanessa, expecting a simple yes or no. Claire always gave the same answer. Forgiveness is rarely a single moment. It is a choice made again and again, especially when memories refuse to disappear. She never forgot the betrayal, the heartbreak, or the years spent believing she had been replaced. But she also never forgot the moment Vanessa pushed her out of the path of that speeding truck without thinking about her own safety. In the end, the woman Claire believed had stolen everything from her became the reason she was still alive to discover the truth. Michael's secrets cost him his marriage, his reputation, and ultimately his life, yet they also exposed a criminal network that might have continued hurting countless innocent people. Sometimes the people we blame are carrying burdens we cannot see. Sometimes the story we believe is only the first chapter of a much larger truth. And sometimes the person you swear you'll never forgive becomes the one who gives you a second chance at life. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what part impacted you the most. And if you believe that truth has the power to change lives, subscribe to the Story Chamber for more unforgettable stories inspired by real-life mysteries, relationships, and extraordinary twists that remind us things are not always what they seem.